fix the problem.
Okay.
Hello, welcome. For those of you who may be joining us in session hopping, I'm Dasa West. I'm the Vice President of Community Impact at the Denver Foundation, and we're really happy to have you with us, either rejoining or newly joining us for this session. I'm going to make the same set of announcements, just in case there are some newcomers to the room, which are please turn your cell phones to silent or to vibrate, so that we don't interrupt our speakers. We have 2 microphones on either side of the room. Start thinking as our speakers are talking about what burning questions you might have, and we'll take as many of those as we have the opportunity for. And then a big thank you to all of our speakers here, as well as the folks who organized the session, particularly Andrea Morgan and Laura Brzezinski. We'll have a little announcement from Community Planning and Development at the very end of this session, so we'll get to hear a little bit of exciting news from them. But it's wonderful to be picking up the second part of this conversation. The first session, for any of you that are newly joining us, was really focused on setting the context. So talking a lot about what the data looks like for renters in the region, what rates of displacement are, what's happening around eviction, what's happening in neighborhoods themselves from the perspective of residents, and that what kinds of specific resources are available to residents. And I think, what we heard is there are a few, but it's still not a very robust system of supports. And so that leads us into this next stage of our conversation, which I think is really exciting. And that's, how do we think about creating a system that is more robust in terms of the ways that we support members of our community in being able to stay in their neighborhoods, in their homes, and connected to their own communities. So we have, again, 3 really wonderful panelists. The first is Kurt Krieger, who's the director of the Portland Housing Bureau. Second, we'll have Councilwoman Robin Kniech, who's, of course, a councilwoman at large on our Denver City Council, and a big champion for this work. And then Sarah Reynolds, the executive director of Housing Colorado, who's doing some Herculean work at the state level. So they're going to share a little bit about both what they're seeing and doing in some places other than Denver, and then what's happening right here at home. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kurt to kick us off. Thanks.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm not quite sure how the word provocateur translates into Spanish, but my job today is to mix things up a little bit and try to lay bare the potential for some policy changes in Colorado, even in light of the strictures that were discussed in the previous session, and I had a chance to sit through most of that. So I am the housing director for the city of Portland. I do not operate the housing authority, which is called Home Forward. The city of Portland has in its own portfolio about 14,000 units of housing, not including vouchers, not including public housing, but things that we finance directly and have long-term use restrictions. These may be owned by nonprofits, they may be owned by for-profits. I'd like to give you a little bit of background on Portland and some of the differences, because I've worked in Colorado for OTAC, did a little bit of work on the Eco District in Sun Valley. OTAC did the largest Eco District in Portland in the South Waterfront, so they are known for that sort of work. But we are different in some respects, but we have some commonalities. Let me talk about one of the commonalities. We both had very telegenic mayors that became secretaries of transportation. You had, of course, Federico Pena, and we had Neil Goldschmidt. And Neil Goldschmidt was Secretary Carter's transportation secretary, which meant that we got light rail about 20 years before Denver did, and some of the issues that we're dealing with are directly related to high-capacity transit and the interconnectivity of housing and jobs. So I think that's worth calling out, because as we look at land use patterns and opportunity areas, there's obviously an infrastructure element that has to be understood. But we are also quite different. One difference is that we have a 5-member city council, and they are elected at large. There are no districts whatsoever in the city. So everyone looks out for the greater good, and no one gets particularly occupied with one particular neighborhood association or one particular property, as you might find, and as I have found in other places I've worked, such as King County and Fairfax, Virginia. All those 5 members are nonpartisan, and the mayor, under our weak mayor form of government, has 2 jobs. The mayor allocates bureaus to the other 4 city commissioners, and those city commissioners have hiring and firing authority over all the directors in the city. So the police chief, the housing director, the transportation director all report to a member of the city commission, and they operate both as legislators and as administrators, which makes for a really interesting situation. There is no city manager, therefore each of the city commissioners has a portfolio. And in my case, housing is the mayor's #1 priority, so he has kept housing in his portfolio. And there are really only 3 priorities: housing, homelessness, and police accountability. And people talk about other priorities, but those are the top 3. And you'll see a little bit what a difference it makes sometimes when those get expressed so clearly and so directly. So Portland's going through a massive change, as you are. I think Portland, Seattle, Denver are the 3 top cost markets right now. Being number 3 at the present time doesn't feel that much different than last year when we were number 1. It's bad, and there are differences in gradations, but 111 people a day are moving to Portland. Many are coming from San Francisco and Seattle. 1/3 of our houses are purchased for all cash, no financing, no contingencies, and no inspections. People just come and they buy things, which is creating a superheated market. And this is emblematic. Old cottage neighborhoods are being subsumed into 5- and 7-story neighborhoods. And under our planning and zoning, we're adding 123,000 new housing units in the next 20 years. This is a roll-up of a lot of data that we prepare, and I'd be happy to give you the background for all this, but the city's Housing Bureau, the city's Planning and Sustainability Bureau, and Portland State University all work together to map opportunity areas. And all of our public policies are aligned to support opportunity areas to the greatest extent possible. This is a gentrification and displacement vulnerability analysis. And I would call your attention to the center of the city. Make sure I have this. I'll have to wave my hand. The area in the middle of the map that's light colored is actually the central city. And the reason it is not subject to displacement and vulnerability is because that already happened. It's already a high-cost area. So as people have been forced to the edges of the city, housing prices therefore change most rapidly on the fringes. And it's reached a state that I would call not just an emergency, but it's really a diaspora. It's a racial diaspora and a class diaspora, which I will talk a little bit more about. This has to do with housing price increases, and here you can see the central city actually being red is the hottest area. So a lot of people are involved with this sort of work in Portland. Portland is a city that loves to engage with its citizens. We have a lot of urban planners. People on council are urban planners, people in practice. Obviously, we have a tradition of planning and engagement. And so this all translates into what we call opportunity analysis. And all of the city's investments are aligned with high opportunity areas. And our housing investments are in the most costly neighborhoods because we're trying to provide an antidote to the gentrification and the market trends. That comes at a cost. That means we're developing housing in the most expensive areas to ensure that opportunities exist in those areas. But as I mentioned, we've had light rail for about 40 years, and neighborhoods are interconnected. The 20-minute neighborhood was invented in Portland as a planning term of art, and that is that live, work, play, and learn ought to be within 20 minutes of one place. So that it may be a transit station away, it may be 2 or 3 transit stations away, but everything you need to live should be within 20 minutes of where you are anywhere in the city. So as it turns out, we have a lot of opportunity areas. We do an annual state of housing assessment, which looks at neighborhood costs for owners, renters by race and ethnicity. And Portland has gone through a rapid transformation. These dark-colored neighborhoods show you which portions of the city are affordable to different communities of color. White households on your far left in 2016. There are no neighborhoods where an average income black household can afford an average income house in the city at all. The same for Native Americans and nearly the same for Latinos. So when I talk about a diaspora, I don't think exaggerating. People of color have been pushed to the very fringes, much the same as in Washington, D.C., where people of color have been pushed into Northern Virginia, suburban Maryland, and West Virginia. But people aren't taking this lying down. Again, because we have a tradition of community engagement, citizen engagement, this particular photograph was over at Trader Joe's in a particular area of North Portland called Albina. The Portland Development Commission, now called Prosper Portland, was providing financing and below-cost site for Trader Joe's, and the people said, hell no, we don't want Trader Joe's. This is emblematic of the problem that we're dealing with. It's not indigenous, it's not authentic, it's not something that we can tolerate. We want housing. So, indeed, they got housing. So what I'm going to tick through are a series of actions taken in the last 2 years, which will hopefully provide at least a springboard for conversation about what could happen in Colorado. First, because of Trader Joe's, the mayor allocated $20 million for Northeast Portland in a special appropriation mid-year. And he tied it specifically to anti-displacement. From that, we developed a preference policy. So all the housing that was developed with this supplemental funding and everything henceforth in North and Northeast Portland, people have a path to return. So people that have been historically displaced through city action get preference points in the placement of any vacancies whatsoever in that area. Be happy to talk more about that, but I was here last year and mentioned it. National Housing Conference actually has a webinar cached on their website, which gives you a deep dive into the preference policy. I think it's over an hour long. And it was developed in consultation with the neighborhood itself directly. So I urge you to look at their website for more detail. In 2015, I started in August. In October of 2015, the City Council declared a state of emergency with respect to housing, which meant that they could waive certain land use codes and ordinances in order to facilitate shelters and housing. And that had a profound effect because it also aligned the City Council's legislative priorities and their funding priorities. Immediately afterwards, the amount of tax increment financing that is allocated by the city for housing went from 30% to 45%. That meant $270 million was moved from economic development to housing development at one time. And that's over the life of these urban renewal areas, which cover about 15% of the city. And then the last bullet on this page, we licensed Airbnb, VRBO, HomeAway, short-term rental platforms, and we taxed them as they were hotel rooms. There's something called a transient lodging tax. But that money was going into the general fund. The police bureau, the fire bureau were all benefiting from that. Because we were able to show the nexus between the loss of affordable housing and the short-term rental platforms, all that money now goes to the Housing Investment Fund, and we are bonding that revenue stream to generate $9 million this year. And that will be used to buy sites, basically, to help offset the loss of affordable housing. And every city has that tool available to them. Voucher utilization is a big problem in Portland. People get vouchers, they have 90 days to find a place, they can't find a place. The turn back rate was about 25%. We wanted to solve that problem. So the city funded a fair market rent study, which allowed HUD to then raise the fair market rents, which allows people more mobility and more units available to them at the higher fair market rent. We also pay for culturally specific navigators to help immigrant families negotiate with landlords. And we pay the judgments and the liens that many tenants have on their record. If you have an unpaid utility bill, you have perhaps a judgment for that, we'll pay for that. It's an unsecured loan, and frankly, about 80% of the people pay us back, but we don't really need the money back. We just want people in housing. So we're getting better utilization of our vouchers as a result. Even though the city of Portland is constrained by some of the same laws that you have, we have a prohibition against rent control. We have a state landlord tenant act developed along the lines of yours. We have still taken several measures. One is we enacted a 90-day notice provision for any no-cause eviction. We do not have, at the present time, a state just cause eviction standard, but we said if you give somebody a no-cause eviction, you've got to give them 90 days. That allows people at least to save up a little bit of money to help mitigate the loss of the unit, so you're not dealing with the 10-day notice requirement that was discussed at the previous panel. In late last year, December 21st, we did enact mandatory inclusionary zoning on any multifamily properties over 20 units in size. And the standard is 20% of the units have to be affordable for people at or above 80% of median income, which is a state standard, or 10% at 60% of median income. And so we basically changed the zoning in 33 different zones across the city at the end of last year, and that went into effect February 1st of this year. I would mention that we provide offsets in the form of density bonuses, tax abatement, SDC waivers, and parking waivers to make sure that the developers are made whole. And that is, I think, going forward, will provide several thousand units of housing in high opportunity areas provided by local developers. This year in January, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that of the 5 city council members, 2 are renters. So renters have a seat at the table, and not unlike Denver, about half of our population are renters. So our agenda is very centered on tenant protections. January of 2017, the City Council said that any rent increase over 10% could trigger, at the election of the tenant, relocation benefits. So fine, we don't have rent control, you can charge whatever rent you want, but if it's over 10%, you have to pay the occupant of a studio $2,700, up to 3 bedrooms, about $5,500. It's being litigated, but the state legislature also has a bill to basically ratify this statewide. So we were seeing rent increases, much the same as we heard in the last panel, of 60% to 100%. So it was a pretty easy political calculation. When people are receiving 100% rent increases, entire classrooms of elementary school kids were having to move mid-year, which was a disaster. Good. And just to wrap up, we have created in our budget, which was approved this week, an Office of Landlord Tenant Affairs. We use general fund resources to pay for legal services so that people have representation at the county court system. And we collect and maintain all the data about displacement. The last thing I'd like to close on is something called no app fee, which is all of the affordable rent-restricted housing within the city of Portland that is managed by the Bureau. Tenants will find vacancies through something called no app fee, and that means they essentially pay nothing in the way of an application fee. We're tired of having to pay 3, 4, 5 application fees to a private developer to get a vacant unit, and the private developer keeps all the fees, right? Do the math on that one. In fact, in our market, people are essentially just using credit scores to select people. The person with the highest credit score gets the unit, and I get the 5 other fees that I've just taken that day. So this is a particularly transparent way by which people can find vacant units. This will be posted to the website, but you have a profile. The profile will tell you then which units are available to you within the city at any given time. And what's interesting is that your profile may come up. In this case, you could have a judgment. This particular case has a judgment. And it tells you which creditor to call to satisfy that judgment. And because the city is paying to alleviate these, we can immediately remove these as barriers to housing. So it's a tool we think will become a citywide platform for all housing vacancies. So I'd be happy to answer questions later.
see our partners at FEST giving standing ovations for that. So let's hear what's happening here at home.
Good afternoon, buenas tardes, ¿cómo están? Bien, dame un momento, por favor. Bueno, soy Robin Kinich, soy miembro del Consejo Municipal aquí en Denver, representa a la ciudad entero y es un honor estar con ustedes aquí. Por respecto a las residentes que hablan español, voy a empezar en español por unos momentos, aunque voy a hacer muchas equivocaciones, como las residentes ya saben, pero por lo general ellos han que escuchar en inglés y por traducción y por respecto a darles unos momentos en su propio idioma. Pero también yo quiero decir gracias a los residentes que están aquí, porque atrás de los últimos años ustedes han contado sus historias, sus preocupaciones, sus experiencias en esta ciudad con desplazamiento. Y eso es muy importante por yo como un elegido, un representante, pero también por las personas que hablan en nuestros departamentos, que implementar política. Todos nosotros necesitamos entender sus voces y sus ideas y por eso gracias por venir aquí hoy, pero también por todas las veces que han venido a la ciudad por reuniones oficiales y no oficiales para contar sus historias. Entonces, gracias. Okay, I'm going to switch to English now. Fewer mistakes, hopefully. I want to recognize some of my colleagues who are in the room. I have Councilwoman Ortega, who is another at-large council member. Councilman Espinoza is here, and also at the conference today has been Councilwoman Gilmore and Councilman Brooks, at least that I've seen. There may be others, but the fact that you have 4 council members here at this conference is just one small indication of how important this issue is to the City Council. We also have a colleague from the school board who's here, Lisa Flores. I want to thank her from the school board representation for being here. So we talk about this issue almost every day at the council, no matter what we're talking about. If we're talking about property taxes, we're thinking about this issue. If we're talking about planning for a new neighborhood or a new development, we're thinking about this issue. So you have succeeded in making sure that we're thinking about it. I'm going to talk about a couple of the things that we are trying to do, and I'm speaking mostly for myself. At a couple moments, I'll be speaking for a subcommittee that I chair called the Housing and Homelessness Workgroup. The department does most of the implementation in the city. So as electeds, we don't do implementation. We talk about policy mostly, but they have a number of other initiatives that I may not cover, but we should hopefully ask about, and maybe folks from the department can answer if there are questions about their work. I want to talk about starting at eviction. How many of you were in the first panel? Raise your hands if you were at the first panel. Okay, so we have a fair bit of turnover. So one of the things we know is that there's more than 8,600 evictions filed in Denver last year. And this was an issue that was brought to me both by the community and by an analysis of our housing plan, that this was the biggest area that we did not have in our current housing plan. And so it made me curious. And I want to thank Enterprise Community Partners has helped connect the data we've gotten from the courts with Harvard, who's going to be doing some analysis on the data to help us understand if there are any trends in terms of neighborhoods or any other trends that we can use to think about solutions. So we're waiting to get that data back. Enterprise is working with Harvard for those answers, and we're looking forward. But we're not going to wait to act to get that data. So the Housing and Homelessness Workgroup was created by the council over a year and a half ago so that we could keep our eyes on this issue in a very kind of oversight, coordinated, spur conversation kind of way. We work with the department, and once a month we meet. And we had 3 conversations after we learned about this data, and Judge Gonzalez and Floyd Jones, who were on the first panel, came and were part of it, as were other legal service providers. The first was we had no one helping folks with emergency assistance who were going through eviction, which meant that if they were going to be homeless, we were not providing them referrals. So we talked with our Department of Human Services as a committee and asked them to begin a pilot. And in that pilot, they put outreach workers into the courtroom, and they basically met with them on the side before or after their hearings. And we actually thought this pilot would just be about helping folks post-eviction, because this wasn't legal assistance. We didn't think it would really stop an eviction from happening. But what we learned is that in some cases, if someone was only behind by maybe 1 month of rent or 2 months of rent, that in some cases, the resources that we had as a city could help folks. So the workers were in the courtroom for a little bit less than a month, just a few weeks, and they prevented about 8 evictions during that time. Some of those folks were folks who just needed a little bit of back rent. In one case, they helped someone with funeral assistance because they had used their rent money to pay for a funeral instead. And then the other folks, some of them, they were not able to end their eviction, but they had other assistance that they helped them apply for and provided referrals. So it's our understanding from the Department of Human Services that they intend to continue this program, maybe working with other departments that also deal with evictions, such as our Sheriff's Department and our Department of Environmental Health, which handles complaints about inadequate plumbing, heating, some of the housing issues. So that's a really important first step, just to get services to folks. The second question was, what about legal assistance? If folks aren't coming to court many of our renters, we learned, aren't coming to court at all. They think there's nothing they can do, so they're not even there. But for those who do come, most are not represented. So our goal was to say, are there some best practices out there for getting representation? Sounds like Portland is funding it directly. We've looked at a number of cities that are using legal clinics, legal volunteers. So our proposal right now is that we have a proposal to work with the court and with the administration to look at those best practice models along with stakeholders who are experts kind of in this issue, both from the renter and the landlord perspective, bring everyone together and look at what might work in Denver, what could we propose. So we're waiting to hear back from the administration about that partnership, and we hope that we'll be able to explore some opportunities to get legal help. Third, we want to talk about policy. In the first panel, we learned the sobering news that a lot of landlord-tenant relations is governed by state law. And that is true, and we made our city attorney double-check that for us. But there are a very small number of areas that we learned are not governed by state law. So what are they? Some cities require landlords to register. We have an interesting situation in Denver. Right now, if you have an Airbnb and you're renting your place for less than 30 days, you have to tell us who you are. You have to tell us that you have a fire exit and that you're paying your taxes. If you're renting for 31 days or more, I have no idea who you are. So we have kind of a situation that's a little unfair. Short-term renters, landlords are registering. We have no idea who the long-term landlords are. But one of the questions is, should we have them register? Why would you have them register? Well, if you have your landlords register, first of all, you can communicate with them. So that's helpful as a city. You can count how many units are out there for rent. We have a number of single-family homes that are being rented, or persons who own maybe one property that aren't obvious to us that they're owned as rentals. The other issue is that you can think about other things that might help protect the renters in your community. So Boulder, we looked at Boulder, and they have a requirement that there be a written lease. So they have, for any rentals of 30 days or more, you must have a written lease. We'd have a question about maybe putting that in multiple languages. Also requiring posting of information, right? So who do you call if there's no heat? Who can you complain to? Where is the legal services hotline that we heard about in the last panel, Colorado Affordable Legal Services, or the Brothers Redevelopment Line? So what are those phone numbers? Could you post some basic information? And then last, what about rent receipts? One of the things that occurs sometimes when folks are being displaced is that they can't prove whether they did or didn't pay something because maybe things are being paid in cash without receipts. So thinking about receipts. So those are all ideas that we've only just learned are possible. We have not yet had time to have a discussion as a council about whether we want to pursue some of these things. Having a registry for landlords in a city the size of Denver would be a huge administration, right? It would be a huge project, not easy to undertake. So none of these things would necessarily be easy, but we will continue to discuss them at the panel of the Housing and Homelessness subgroup and engage our partners, from the other agencies like the Office of Economic Development in the conversation. So that's a little bit about eviction. We have heard about this resident preference policy in Portland, and we are interested in hearing more about that. So I'm going to watch the webinar, but we're also going to host a discussion about it to see whether or not we have any. It's a very strict standard, is our understanding, and we want to see if we have some opportunities to meet that standard to be able to do that kind of preference. $1.5 million from our new housing fund is being set aside for to keep people in their homes. We already have some emergency assistance for folks to avoid eviction if they are behind on 1 month rent, but it's for the very poorest of our residents. Our hope is that the new funding will allow us to help folks who earn a little more but are still struggling. Maybe you got a rent increase, you need 3 months until you can move, until you can find a new place, so it might help to bridge those few months. Or you had a one-time car breakdown or a one-time effect. What it can't do is help someone afford a place they can't afford. If you don't make enough to afford your place long-term, this is not the answer, but it can help with all those one-time situations and those gaps. 2 more things I'm going to mention because I'm running out of time. The West Denver Renaissance Collaborative is happening in West Denver, and they are thinking about, we have a number of folks who are lower income who own their homes. It's sometimes we don't think about it. We think everyone who's lower income is a renter, but it's not true. Either they bought their house when it was cheap, or they, retired and went on a fixed income after they were already homeowners. So for those folks, is it possible that giving them an accessory dwelling unit that might be a source of income for the family, as well as a new housing unit for maybe a grandmother, for an adult child, for a neighbor, someone else who needs housing, could it hit 2 goals? So they're looking at that topic in West Denver, and they're also looking at which apartment buildings are most likely to get turned over for turning them into luxury buildings. So they're looking at that. In the audience today, we have DURA, D-U-R-A, Denver Urban Renewal Authority, and they have a program for homeowners that provides repair assistance if you have a life and safety issue like a roof, windows, furnace. So we do have some things we're thinking about for homeowners as well. Evictions focuses on renters, but we know that homeowners need assistance too, and those new dollars I mentioned from the city, that $1.5 million, could be eligible for homeowners as well if they're struggling. Lastly, I just want to say that we have a lot of gentrification study analysis that was built actually off the Portland model that Denver did. We talked about it last year, which is why you're not hearing that same map this year, but it exists on the Office of Economic Development website. We are trying to do that same early warning system of which neighborhoods are at risk and focusing employment resources and other things. All of those are things you would have to have the department speak to because they're on that not so much policy level, but program level. But I want you to know that that is something we're very interested in, and this council will continue to be passionate, and I love the ideas I've learned today. I'm hoping to learn more. We'll add them to our research list, and we will continue the conversation during the question and answer. Thank you.
All right, we've been hearing about how important the state level is, so Sarah is going to come give us a few minutes about that, and then we'll dive into questions.
All right, thank you, Desa. So good afternoon now. It's actually afternoon, so good afternoon. My name is Sarah Reynolds. I'm with Housing Colorado. And Housing Colorado, for those of you who maybe are not familiar with us, we are the industry trade association for the affordable housing industry. So our members are folks who develop and build affordable housing, who fund affordable housing, as well as some of those nonprofits and government agencies that actually administer those affordable housing assets once they're developed. So it's a very broad-based association, and because we have a statewide focus, we are particularly engaged on state legislation each year and advocating for affordable housing preservation and development of more affordable housing throughout the state. So this year, interestingly, I've been with Housing Colorado for about 5 years now, and this year I would say we probably saw more bills aimed at renters' rights than we have seen in quite some time. A lot of this is due to House Speaker Crisanta Duran, who was just elected by her colleagues as Speaker of the House for this session. She'll be Speaker of the House next session as well. She's also based here in Denver, and this was a real priority for her. She's been a very long-time champion of affordable housing funding, but from her perspective, she also felt that getting into this area of renters' protections was another way to address that affordability, but just from a slightly different angle. So as we've talked about today, many of the renters' issues are governed through contract, which are governed through state law. So there are some options from state policy in terms of what we can do to strengthen some of those contractual obligations and provide at least a little bit more breathing room for renters. So there was it was a bit of a mixed bag. So I'll talk a little bit about what did and also what did not happen. So on the area of what did happen, there was a bill passed in the Senate that impacted leases or situations where there's no written lease. And we've heard earlier in the session that, or in today's workshop, that that landlords generally only need to provide a 7-day notice to quit. Notice to quit is that they're removing that person from the property. Senate Bill 245 extended that from 7 days to 21 days, but only in the situation where there is no written lease. The other provision within Senate Bill 245 is that it requires a 21-day notice for any rent increase, but again, in a situation where there is no written lease. Now, I was really surprised at the group that handed out the Globeville, Elyria, Swansea, that blue handout, fascinated that in that neighborhood, over 50% of renters are in a situation where there's no written lease. So when you hear about bills like 245, you think, well, boy, that's how many people are really being impacted by this? And you can see in certain neighborhoods in Denver, and I would argue in other communities throughout the state, there's actually a really high number of renters who are being impacted by exactly that situation where there is no written lease and therefore there's no contract to protect them. And so this fits that particular situation, providing some protections for those renters. And that bill passed the House, passed the Senate, and it's on its way to the governor for signature. So it's a really great victory this year for some of those communities that are especially hit hard by this situation. The other bill that we followed that was part of the broader conversation of renters' rights, but a little more specific, and that was a House Bill 1035, and that dealt with victims of sexual assault and stalking. That it extended some of the privileges in current statutes so that if you are a victim of sexual assault or stalking, you are able to terminate your lease with no penalty. And this was, again, for many situations, this is a health and safety issue, not only for the victim, but it's a health and safety issue for the other tenants in that building. And so this is a bill that actually had minimal to no opposition because even property managers recognize the safety of that individual and the safety of all their neighbors is paramount. And so that was no longer going to be a barrier for an individual or family to be able to move to a different situation, because the penalties when you terminate a lease early are extremely, extremely steep and were a barrier for many folks. Now, moving on to just a couple of things that did not happen this session. We had two other renters' rights bills. One was House Bill 1310, and I do want to just mention on the Housing Colorado website, under our policy tab, we have a summary of all the bills that we monitored this year and the outcomes of that. So if you're jotting down some of these bill numbers and you're not quite catching all the details, don't worry, it's all on our website and you can get more information there. But House Bill 1310 would have capped the application fees that landlords could assess on rental applications. And that was just mentioned earlier on this panel. And that bill unfortunately did not pass, but there's really good precedent in other states around the country that have done this. California, most notably, has been real active in this area. And this bill, unfortunately, it did pass the House, but it did not pass the Senate. But I do think that the legislators who are going to be working on this issue have every intention of bringing this back next year. One of the areas that we got involved in from Housing Colorado's perspective is we have the benefit of working directly with affordable housing providers who are landlords, who were a great asset in the conversation around this particular legislation, because we were able to craft it in a way that really made sense in terms of providing renters, in terms of providing renters some assurances on the fees that were going to be collected, but then also allowing those property managers to comply with some of their requirements, particularly if you are an affordable provider. There's additional paperwork and other administrative costs that come with that. Unfortunately, that bill did not pass, but we're really pleased with where the conversation headed, and we have hope that it will come back again next year. The other bill that did not pass was House Bill 1312, and again, this was mentioned today. This was a bill that would have simply required a written lease for all rental agreements and a receipt for any payments received in cash. Most payments, if it's done online or through a check, there's some sort of history, there's some sort of written record that that payment had been made. But there's a lot of situations where it is just a cash payment, and our landlords are not required to provide that receipt. So this was unfortunately it passed the House but did not pass the Senate. But I do think we will see it again next year. Now, a couple other issues that never saw actual bills introduced this year. This was a proposal that was discussed but not introduced, and this would have prevented discrimination based on sources of income. We've talked a little bit, and you've heard some about voucher programs and how it's very difficult for a voucher recipient to find a landlord who's willing to accept that voucher, even though we've made some progress in some of the reimbursement rates and matching fair market rent with what those vouchers can reimburse. Technically, I was actually very surprised to hear this, that landlords don't have to accept those vouchers, and that there's nothing that protects renters with those vouchers from that type of discrimination. That bill, again, never was actually drafted, but it's a concept that's out there that we may see in future sessions, and certainly want to monitor that, because I do know, working with some of our housing authorities, the rate of return, the relinquishment of those vouchers is extraordinarily high in the metro area, ranging from anything from 40 to 60% of vouchers that end up getting turned back in simply because the voucher holder can't find a landlord who's willing to take that voucher. So definitely, something that's hindering the effectiveness of that particular program. And finally, I would not be doing my job if I didn't talk a little bit about funding for affordable housing. There's obviously an enormous demand for rental housing. We have 100,000 new households moving to Colorado every year, and the simple laws of supply and demand. If there are not enough units available, and there's more renters, then you start to see the vacancy rates extremely low, rents going very high. One of the ways to address this is by just adding more inventory. And yes, it's true, we can't necessarily just build our way out of some of these issues, but certainly more resources to provide more affordable housing and to really ramp up the amount of units that are on the ground and available would decrease some of that demand. And as that goes down, then we would naturally see some of those market rate rents follow suit. So, that is something that's a top priority for many of my affordable housing providers and the broader industry, and it's something that we continue to work for every year in the state legislature. So I know we are out of time, and I want to leave plenty of time for discussion, but just appreciate your focus and attention on this issue, because it is obviously very complex. So thank you.
All right, thanks to our panel. Lots of really rich information, so hopefully that sparked some questions. I see already Randall has one, so let's kick it off.
Okay, we didn't mention motels. We didn't mention 0 to 30% AMI. We didn't mention the whole issue of housing stock going down, which you said in the first presentation. The tax credits, the LIHTC and so forth may go away completely. We don't have anything going on regarding the cost of putting this housing together. Basically, we got $15.3 million, which was not mentioned from the state legislature for homelessness, but we need a housing trust fund. And I have said in many occasions, over $50 million a year would be a good start. And the housing for the Front Range alone, we need $1 billion to take care of the low-income housing that I was just referring to. What are your thoughts about how we actually meet the demand, particularly with people who lose their income stream, which is a very important thing, and then are kicked out on the street.
I think both of us, we can both answer
Yeah,
that.
do you want to start on that?
Yeah, I can start on that. I've got my microphone's on. Yes, thank you, Randall. In the interest of time, I did mention the two funding proposals that were pretty significant this year, one that passed, one didn't. This year, the governor proposed a $16 million cash transfer from the Marijuana Cash Fund to the Division of Housing for the development of permanent supportive housing for particularly vulnerable populations, those that are homeless and below 30% AMI. That was an enormous infusion of resources in an area that is very expensive to fund, but truly is our most vulnerable population. And that was not easily won in terms of the political support for that particular issue. But we were really grateful that at the end of the day, we did have two Republican senators when this proposal came to the Senate who voted in support of it. And it does just, and interestingly, they weren't from the metro area. They were from rural Colorado, because this is an issue we're seeing everywhere in this state. So that's a big victory. The big disappointment from this session was the failure of House Bill 1309, and this would have created a dedicated and permanent revenue source for affordable housing development throughout the state. It would have only provided about $9 million per year, but absent having no dedicated and permanent funding source at the moment, it would have been a positive step in the right direction. Fortunately, that bill did pass the House. We got a lot of great traction in there, including bipartisan support. And in spite of having bipartisan support in the Senate, it died in Senate committee. But the work continues on that, because as Randall mentions, when you look at the number of low-income housing tax credit properties, we're at huge risk of losing a good amount of affordable inventory because they're 30, 40-year-old properties, and the requirements, the affordability requirements expire. So we have the same amount of resources to develop new housing, but now we're having to divide those limited resources for preservation as well as construction of new units. So funding, again, you really can't have this conversation without talking about funding. And I know there's obviously the efforts on the Denver side.
Yeah, so I will just say that we have a housing fund in Denver, but it's not permanent. It was proposed as permanent, and at the last minute, a vote was made to give it a sunset in 10 years. You should ask your council members about making it permanent. You should ask your mayor. The mayor supported it as permanent. The mayor did not propose the sunset. That came from city council members. So first things first, you can remove that sunset, and then that fund would be permanent into perpetuity. So that's one way to ensure resources in Denver. Two, we know the funds that we set aside were not enough. We knew that at the time, but they were the first ever fund of this size in the state, as you heard, twice as big as the state was proposing, so not insignificant. We do look at other sources, so general obligation bonds. Right now, there is a proposal to bring a bond to the voters this fall for roads, transit, for city buildings, police stations, all of that stuff. There's one proposal in there right now for a supportive housing project that would be shelter, supportive housing, and transitional housing. So it is primarily a housing project with a shelter on the ground floor approach, and that is $20 million is the current recommendation. It could go up or down as the conversation continues. So if you're interested in that, you can let your mayor and your council know that you support the bond, including that. Also, you've probably seen polling from our community saying that they think we should think about a dedicated housing bond. So there's legal research and other conversations happening about that. The city only has so much bonding capacity, so that's a question. But I absolutely think all those conversations need to be on the table. The one other thing I'll say, and Randall, I so appreciate your question, but I want to disagree that we weren't talking about 0 to 30% in the first part of this conversation. Only 1 out of 4 poor renters is in subsidized housing, which means that 3 out of 4 of them are living in the housing we're talking about that's dealing with evictions. All of these things impact 0 to 30% of AMI folks. So I just want to make really clear that when we talk about the low-income homeowners I'm talking about, some of them earn less than $20,000. Depending on your family size, that is 0 to 30. So the things I talked about, many of them apply to that full income spectrum. We don't have enough rental assistance at that lowest level. The one thing I mentioned is that our new program goes a little higher, but that's as a limit. It still includes that lowest income of the lowest income, and it has to, because they are the most vulnerable of homelessness, of the health impacts, of trading off food for housing. You know, folks who are at the 100% of AMI level, I may worry a little bit if they're paying too much for housing. I worry that they'll relocate out of the area. I will worry about their ability to be stable, but that's a little bit different than them being on the streets or them skipping meals because their housing is costing too much. And so we do have to stay focused on that, and I think it's a really important point. Thanks.
I would just mention that last November, Portland voters, to the tune of 63%, did approve a $258 million general obligation bond issue. Half of that money will be spent on housing for people between 0 and 30%. And the Home Forward, our local housing authority, has co-joined about 400 project-based rental assistance vouchers with that $258 million. So we will reach a good number of folks that need not just 0 to 30 income, but also need the accompanying services. So it's an essential part of what we do. We haven't provided the necessary ongoing operating cost, and we currently have an unmet need of about 1,700 PSH units in the city of Portland, according to the Corporation for Supportive Housing, which of course is not a city bureau, it's a national nonprofit. To support that on an ongoing basis would cost between $40 and $60 million a year. And that would be mental health services, alcohol, substance abuse treatment services, and so forth. So it doesn't sound like a lot of units, but by ensuring services and successful outcomes, it doesn't involve a big financial contribution.
So I was so worried about our last panel going long because we had 5 speakers instead of 3, but I think we're going to have time for about 2 more questions, and then we're going to need to take it home. So John?
Thank you to the panel for the discussion. Denver's in the process of updating its 20-year land use and transportation plan, Blueprint Denver. And as we're looking at this long term, I'd like to hear from Portland and from Robin here in Denver, what do you think is the most important thing we could include in that 20-year plan to address this issue long term, so that hopefully in 20 years we're in a better place because we planned for it?
Real quickly, the city of Portland, Oregon has state land use planning, and since 1970, we've had urban growth boundaries. So the way it works is our metropolitan planning organization called Oregon Metro gives us a number, which is the amount of population we need to accommodate for the next 20 years. And our 2035 comprehensive plan was just adopted, and that number is 123,000 units. So we will add 123,000 units in the next 20 years. Of that, about 10% will be permanently affordable, and 3,000 units will be ADUs. So we already have put into place the necessary zoning. Because the central city already has this abundant FAR, most of this density will occur in the transit corridors, which are the various bus routes, not light rail transit routes, but they tend to be bus and bus rapid transit routes emanating from the city. And those are currently commercial corridors with 1- and 2-story buildings. Those will be replaced by 5- and 7-story buildings. Our ADUs, we're pretty generous when it comes to ADUs. ADUs are allowed on any single-family lot of record. And the current council is considering adding a provision which will allow 2 ADUs per lot, which is the same as what you find in Vancouver, British Columbia. So I think the plan does a pretty good job of covering that. There is something called the missing middle. We don't have enough flexibility in our housing stock to allow quads, triplexes, duplexes. They were very popular after World War II, but in the 80s and 90s, they tended to be zoned out of the city. So a lot of the neighborhoods are being retrofitted to address the missing middle also.
I'll be really quick. Supply matters. Boulder has restricted supply and restricted height and restricted density, and it has absolutely made that city unaffordable. So supply matters, but the second thing I'll say is we can't do inclusionary housing for rentals in Denver and Colorado because of our state laws. But We spend enormous public resources, and I think if our 20-year plan made it very clear that when we spend public resources, there has to be affordable housing associated with them, we can do that. And we, whether it's our urban renewal areas, you can follow those maps, and it's our money that generally is leading the gentrification. And so we can control that by saying we don't make this investment if it isn't paired with housing. I think that needs to be in our long-term plan.
Good, yeah, have at it, go ahead. I'm actually going to come over here for the final question because Maria had a chance to ask one a little bit earlier. So hold on just unless you want to grab the mic over here and do. Let's get our translator over.
Señor Kerr, en Portland ofrecen recursos, muchos recursos y muy buenos los que escuchamos. Mi pregunta es, para las personas que tienen seguro social, ¿también ellos califican?
So this question is for Kurt. I know that in Portland they offer great resources from what we heard. We saw that you guys have great services, but I'm wondering if people who don't have a Social Security number, can they also qualify for this?
Yes. Portland, let me reframe the question. Oregon is a sanctuary state. All local governments in Oregon, cities and counties, are prevented from asking immigration status. And that is a state law that's been in existence for several years. We don't make a big deal out of it because it's normal for us. So as far as immigration status is concerned, we don't really care. When it comes to our stock, we follow the federal standard because we're using project-based rental assistance vouchers in many of our units. And the federal policy currently says that one person in the household has to be a legal resident. That may be a baby. It could be an 8-person house with one person. But so that's the standard that we're using, and until the federal standard changes, that's the standard we'll use going forward.
Great. All right, I'm going to invite Cortland Heiser from Community Planning and Development to come up and make a quick announcement. As he's making his way up, please, if you have a device, put it on the table on your way out. And I also wanted to just let you all know that a recording of this session is going to be available on the Office of Economic Development's website within about a month. So you can look there if you missed either part of the session. So come on up.
Right. And I'll actually let Mallory Batag from our office start off.
Hi, I'm Mallory. I'm a planner with Community Planning and Development, and I just wanted to make you all aware of the community-based planning effort that's going on right now, known as Denver Right. It's a large planning effort that encompasses 4 different plans in the city. That includes Blueprint Denver, which is our land use and transportation plan, as well as 2 Denver Moves plans for transit and pedestrians and bicycles, as well as the game plan, which is our parks and recreation plan. So we're kind of all in different phases right now with all the different plans, but we have some handouts in kind of the atrium area if you want to come out and visit us, ask us any questions, and we can point you towards some resources and kind of some efforts that we're undergoing right now as a part of that plan.
Right. So a few minutes ago, John asked the question, what needs to be in Blueprint Denver? This is an important guiding document for the next 20 years for the city. And part of the answer for that is that we want you to tell us what needs to be in Blueprint Denver as well. So please do visit our station. You can get information and materials on how to engage and participate in the process. And in addition to Blueprint and the Denver Right planning process, the city this year is also initiating a new planning model for neighborhood planning, small area planning. It's called the Neighborhood Planning Initiative. Now, the Denver Right plans are citywide plans. They're big ideas. And because of the scale of analysis of those plans, they can only go into a certain amount of detail. And where you get the highly detailed guidance is in neighborhood planning. So we will, over the next 10 10 to 14 years, be systematically updating neighborhood plans citywide as part of the Neighborhood Planning Initiative. And we're kicking off the first 3 of those plans this year, the first of which will have a kickoff meeting June 22nd for far northeast Denver. That's Montbello, Gateway, Green Valley Ranch area. And then later this year, 2 plans for neighborhoods along Colfax from downtown to Colorado. And then the third plan being the neighborhoods along Colfax from Colorado out to Aurora. So please stop by our station, learn more, and engage in these efforts.
Great, thanks, guys. So let's have a big hand for our panelists. And thanks so much to all of you for being here and engaging in the conversation.